we've just gone stale. Nextdoor, the product has not changed as much as the world has changed. It has not risen up to become contemporary and modern and indispensable to today's audience. We're looking for something that looks, feels, and operates completely different. And so sometimes when that's the task, bringing in someone who has the credibility of having been there from the beginning, but the freshness to really make those big changes, that can be an asset.
Welcome to The Peel. I'm your host, Turner Novak, founder of Banana Capital. Today's guest is Nirav Tolia, co-founder and two-time CEO of Nextdoor. We talk about starting the company in 2011.
There wasn't a social network that was devoted to what we believed was the most important community of them all, and that is the community in which you live.
Why he stepped down as CEO in 2018.
The job of leadership is to rise up and meet that challenge. And at that point, 8 years in, I wasn't ringing the bell like I really should have.
And returning as CEO in May of 2024.
I knew that if I were sitting on my deathbed and someone came to me and said, hey, you started that Nextdoor thing and it didn't really go as well as you wanted it to, why didn't you get in there and do something about it?
Our conversation goes deep into the early days, including how Bill Gurley inspired the pivot that led to Nextdoor.
He looked at me and said, hey, kind of seems like you're giving up. And he slid across a piece of paper.
How the book, The Founder's Mentality, taught him to think like a startup while running a public company.
I'm optimistic. I'm excited. I believe deeply. I also feel like I get kicked in the stomach 100 times a day.
How he's thinking about evolving Nextdoor's product.
Local, from a business standpoint, is one of the only remaining massive consumer opportunities.
Inside his first company, Epinions, which IPO'd in 2004.
I met this absolutely brilliant person, Naval,
and his experience as a shark on Shark Tank before coming back to Nextdoor.
Some things that people might be surprised to know about Shark Tank. The first thing is,
before we talk to Nirav, I publish new episodes on my show, The Peel, every week, exploring the world's greatest startup stories. Check the show notes, explore the back catalog of almost 100 episodes, and subscribe to make sure you never miss one. Nirav, how's it going? Welcome to the show.
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you too. You have a pretty interesting setup right now. Probably the first time in the history of the show I've had someone on who started a company, left, and then came back to rejoin as CEO.
Lots of founders, but maybe the first refounder.
Yeah, can you kind of just tell us the story? Like what happened?
It's pretty improbable. I mean, I'd say on one hand, it's been an incredible blessing for me and a privilege to come back because I love the company and I love the people around the company and I love the intellectual challenges associated with the company. But I did not think after leaving as CEO the first time that I would come back again. One of the reasons why is because I don't think it was exactly my choice to leave the first time. And so I was definitely starting to hit a wall in regards to my scalability as a leader. I've mostly in my career been an early stage founder and CEO. That's primarily what I've done for a couple of decades. So I've done it for a long time. And after running Nextdoor for almost 9 years, so I started the company in the summer of 2010. And then if we fast forward to early 2018, it was clear that some of the things that the company required were out of reach for me as a leader. And whenever that happens, you have an opportunity to grow as a leader because at every stage of a company, the company needs more from its leadership, or at the very least, it needs different things from its leadership. And the job of leadership is to rise up and meet that challenge. And for whatever reason, at that point, 8 years in, I wasn't ringing the bell like I really should have, or even I believe like I could have. And so we felt that Nextdoor had a ton of potential. Very, very, very smart, very accomplished board of directors who wanted Nextdoor to be as successful as it possibly could be. And ultimately, the decision was made for there to be a leadership transition. And I wouldn't say that it was an easy process for me to go through. At the same time, I didn't fight it as much because I saw it as well. I felt it as well. I was not the best version of myself as a leader, as a executive, even as a person. I was burned out. And the stress of these jobs is something that maybe people don't always talk about because it's always the glory of achieving something or the delight of creating something. But these are hard jobs. They really weigh on you. They grind you down quite a bit. And I'd kind of lost my mojo a little bit. And so when the time came for me to move on, I was ready. The company was ready and I was ready. And I would say the best thing that I was able to do, and I give my wife a lot of credit for this, I was able to say, look, whatever happened in the past doesn't really matter. I'm proud of Nextdoor. I love the company. I want it to succeed. But now this is an opportunity for me to do the next thing in my life. And that next thing was not going to be a founder or a CEO. I moved to Italy with my wife and 3 young kids. We wanted to live in a foreign country and have a completely different experience. I was lucky to teach a class from my alma mater, Stanford. So I became a visiting professor at Stanford in Florence. Ultimately, I joined a venture capital firm, Head of Sophia, as executive chairman. Head of Sophia had been an investor for Nextdoor. And so I was very familiar with the firm and its founder. And I was loving learning to be an investor. I was loving advising entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs that were going on the journey that I'd gone on. So I did not think I would ever come back to being a CEO. Certainly, I didn't believe that I would come back to Nextdoor. At the same time, I'd never really left Nextdoor.
Because you stayed on the board, right? Yep.
Yeah, I was on the board. I was the largest individual shareholder. I love this company. That never stopped. And there were so many people that I had worked with that were still part of the company. But I changed the way that I was involved with the company. And that was from being an operator to being more of a board member. And that's a massive shift in what you see, what you know, and what you can do. I mean, it's sort of like shifting from driving the car to just riding in the back seat and being able to look out the windshield so you kind of see where you're going, but you have no control really, or very limited control. And no one likes a backseat driver. And so having been a CEO for a long time with board members, I was not going to be that board member that was trying to micromanage our CEO. I was going to be the patient person in the back seat that was just hoping very optimistically that we were headed in the right direction. And ultimately, when it became clear to everyone that we weren't getting to where we wanted to go, we needed to make another leadership transition. And either I was the only one who they could get to do the job, or hopefully, I think when the story's told, I will be the best person to come back. But one way or another, here I am.
So what was kind of the decision like then to come back? Because it sounds like that was not on your radar to come back. Like what went into it?
No, it really wasn't. And it wasn't as much an intellectual or I would say empirically driven decision as it was an emotional one. But what Nextdoor needed and what we still need is the transformation of our core product. And so it was very clear to us as board members, and this includes Sarah Fryer, who was CEO at the time, that this was a period of time in the company's history where there needed to be product innovation. And so as we started to think about who are the kinds of leaders that would bring that spirit of product innovation into the company, there is something very special about the way a founder looks at innovating a product, because I wasn't the only founder. I wasn't the only person who came up with the idea for Nextdoor, but I was one of them. And so I understand Nextdoor in a way that very few people in the world understand it. I was building it with a few people at the very beginning. And so there's an advantage, I believe, in being a founder when you're building innovative product. And ultimately, we thought as a board, there was an additional advantage in a founder coming back, because not only did I have that context and that history, I hadn't been running the business for 5 years. So I had fresh eyes.
Yeah, you kind of had that emotional attachment, but you could also come in and say, what's going on? What needs to be fixed? What should be changed?
100%. I think hopefully what I have tried to do is to find some balance between keeping what's great about Nextdoor, and that's the DNA of the company, our focus on local community, the absolute devotion we have to neighbors and building an indispensable local application, but thinking about it in an evolved way. Because ultimately, what has happened to our product, and I think it happens to a lot of products, we've just gone stale. Nextdoor, the product has not changed as much as the world has changed. It has not risen up to become contemporary and modern and indispensable to today's audience in much the same way that it was maybe in the past. And so that's going to require not just an incremental adjustment or two, that is going to require transformation. We've said internally, if you think about this like a software product, we're not looking for a point release going from 2.1 to 2.2. We're looking for a version release. We're looking for something that looks, feels, and operates completely different. And so sometimes when that's the task, bringing in someone who has the credibility of having been there from the beginning, but the freshness to really make those big changes, that can be an asset. And we're hoping that's the case here.
So I know family is really important to you, and the decision to come back was a family decision. I think anyone with kids, anyone who's, in a relationship, multiple generations, it's they think about it a lot when they're thinking about their career. How did you kind of decide, just with all the stakeholders in the family, that it was the right decision to come back?
It's tough for me to think about even now. I have professionally found coming back to Nextdoor to be, as I mentioned at the beginning, an incredible privilege and a blessing. I am so excited and invigorated, and I wake up every morning very grateful to have this job. That's professionally. But on the personal side, it has required and will require enormous sacrifice. It did require enormous sacrifice when I was running the company the first time. And one of the reasons why I was ready to step down is because I wanted to spend more time with my family. In fact, post-COVID, my wife and three kids and I decided to move to Texas, where I grew up, because we wanted to be closer to family. And my mom and dad are in Dallas. My only sibling is in Dallas with his wife and their wonderful children. And an ability for our three sons, my wife and me, to be closer to family and to focus on that, that was a priority for us. If I thought I were going to come back to Nextdoor, or if I thought I was going to come back to Silicon Valley at all, I wouldn't have made that decision. But ultimately, I knew that if I didn't come back to Nextdoor, it would be a regret. I knew that if I were sitting on my deathbed and someone came to me and said, "Hey, you started that Nextdoor thing, and gosh, it didn't really go as well as you wanted it to. Why didn't you get in there and do something about it?" I knew that I would have a regret. And my wife is so wonderful in supporting me and knows that we don't want to live with regrets. And so the discussion was not really, again, about putting a spreadsheet together to understand exactly how are we going to navigate this. And my wife is a very ambitious, very successful executive herself. She's the president of Shonda Rhimes' company, Shondaland. So she has a big job herself. Our three young sons are 12, 10, and 8. And so they're in the primes of their childhoods. And my parents are in their mid-80s. I was enjoying spending time with them. And my brother, for the first time since I left Texas to go to Stanford for college, I had never been around my family in the same way. So enormous sacrifice, and yet Nextdoor is something that I love. So this season in my life, my wife agreed with me that this season would be about Nextdoor. And we went in eyes wide open because I'd been the CEO before. I mean, when you're a CEO, when you're a founder, it's hard to think about other things. It's hard to have that mythical work-life balance that everyone talks about. I think it's much more about harmonizing work and life. And one of the ways that we harmonize in our family is we say, in this given period of time, what is the priority going to be? I feel so blessed that for the last 5 years, my priority was family. It's why we moved to Texas. It's why I wasn't an operator. It's why we made so many of our decisions over the last 5 years. The 20 years prior to that, almost every decision I made personally was driven by my professional pursuits. And so that was a departure. But now coming back, I don't pretend to be wiser in some way so that I can work smarter, not harder, or I don't pretend to have some magic formula through Zoom or virtual meetings where I don't have to show up the way that I did the first time. It's enormously difficult to run these companies, to build these products, to be successful in our industry. And for me, that is going to take sacrifice. I'm just really lucky because my wife and kids are supporting me in that endeavor, but it's not easy.
Yeah. And I think we were talking about this a little bit beforehand. I didn't mention this. So I actually live with my in-laws, and also my wife's grandma lives in a little kind of cottage on the property that we have. So we've got 4 generations all living together.
You're very lucky. You're very lucky. I always say that hearing the laughter of my parents and my kids when they're together is one of the most beautiful sounds in the world. And it really helps you understand that circle of life and your place in it, right? Because you're looking up to your parents who provided everything for you, and you're looking down at your kids who you want to provide everything for. And, to bridge that into these sacrifices we make professionally, my children were all born during the first 8+ years when I was creating and running Nextdoor. So they're familiar with Nextdoor. They were born and raised in San Francisco, but they were young. And so by the time they started to become aware of me in more of a kind of childhood sense versus a baby or infant sense, I wasn't working the way that I was when I was CEO of Nextdoor. So I don't even know, to some extent, if they even understood what it was like for daddy to be a CEO, because being an investor is very different. You have a lot more leverage in your personal life when you're an investor than you do as an operator. And so now that I've come back, they joke sometimes and say, well, Daddy, we used to love Nextdoor and now we're not really so sure because it's taking you away. But I think for them, they are observing a value that my wife and I believe very strongly in, which is the value of responsibility, the value of commitment, the value of accountability, the value of being able to make sacrifices in the near term, because in the long term, something's really important to you. And so I'm hoping that they will pick that stuff up, but I miss them a lot. And I think the really hard thing about not being in Silicon Valley, which is where our headquarters is, it's not just the long hours. It's not being able to kiss them goodnight before they go to bed or take them to school in the morning, right? But that's why we got to make Nextdoor successful. Like it's very, very, very important to me personally and professionally.
Speaking about making Nextdoor successful, I think you're at this point, maybe 6 months. I don't know the date. It'll probably be about 7 months when the time this comes out. But what did the first couple months look like? Like, how do you come back in? What were the priorities? What are you looking for? And then maybe more recently, I'm assuming now you're like, all right, we've got a plan. What's the plan for kind of the next phase of the company?
Whenever you go into a new situation, whether it's starting a company or restarting or refounding a company or just taking a new job, there's that early period where it's almost pure adrenaline. And I felt like the single most important thing to do when I came in was to learn, and you can only learn by listening. So the most important thing for me coming into Nextdoor was to relearn what the company was about, because it wasn't my company. It wasn't a company that I had been running. The majority of employees had been hired after I had left. The product was completely different. And so I had to learn and familiarize myself with what was going on. And it was just great to be back around people in an operating context. So one of the things I realized almost off the bat is how much I missed being part of a team. And I enjoyed learning to be an investor. And I don't know that I felt that I was a great investor or even on the road to being a great investor. I was still relatively early in the journey. It had only been a couple of years. But coming back to be an operator, immediately that visceral sense of being in the room with other people and coming together to solve problems, it's kind of like community, which is the whole point of Nextdoor. And the whole point of us moving to Dallas, we were creating a family community. So it felt very additive to my life to come back into this Nextdoor community. But at the beginning, it was really kind of learning as fast as possible, drinking from a fire hose, and learning on so many different vectors, learning about the company that I knew some things about, but not everything, learning what it was like to be a public company CEO versus a startup CEO, learning enough about the outside world and our users' needs in that world to craft a product strategy that we believe will serve them better than we are today. So there was a ton of learning, and reflecting on it, even as we have this conversation, I love learning. I love that feeling that you go to bed at night exhausted because there's so much more information in your brain than there was when you started. I'm still honestly in that phase, now 6 or 7 months in, but I have my sea legs. And most importantly, I've gotten to know my teammates in a way that I didn't when I first came in. And to me, it's always been about who first and then what. And so from the beginning, I wanted to not just learn about the business and our challenges and product strategy. I wanted to learn about the people. I want to learn about my teammates, right? Who's going to stay? Who's going to go? Who am I going to bring in? How are we going to work together, right? What's the community that we're going to build that's going to enable this larger community of Nextdoor for our almost 100 million verified neighbors? Those were the things that I was doing. And one of the reasons I traveled so much and still travel is because I believe that learning happens best when you're right next to someone. You can do it the way we're doing it right now. But if you're sitting right next to someone, there's just there's an enhanced sense of connection there that's difficult to get when you're not in the same room, occupying the same physical space. And so those first couple months, I just wanted to drink up as much of Nextdoor and its people as I possibly could.
Did it work? Like, do you feel like you learned anything interesting or any mindset change that you had kind of from maybe the beginning of May of 24 to today?
Let me frame it slightly differently, which is, as I mentioned, very improbable that I would come back. And I also mentioned that I was not as effective a leader as I wanted to be when I left. So in the intervening 5 years, I think I've done a lot of thinking about what kind of leader I want to be, what kind of leader I wish I had been, never with the intention of coming back to Nextdoor, or never even with the intention of being the same type of leader as a founder or a CEO or being in a startup at all. More just trying to understand myself better and trying to evolve as a human being and learn what makes me tick and how can I lift people up. As I get older, the one thing that's really important to me is I not only want to make myself feel good, I feel good if I can make other people around me feel good as well. And so when I came back, I think there was another vector of learning that continues. And that vector is, what can I do to be the best version of myself in this role? You asked, is it working? The output's always a lagging indicator, a trailing indicator, right? We don't know. I mean, we hope. We don't know though, right? We've put up some decent quarters and we feel good about the trajectory, but we're very far from that breakthrough. And I think in some ways that breakthrough is kind of a myth. I mean, it's 1,000 small steps that ultimately looks like one giant leap. We are trying as hard as we can, and I am trying as hard as I can to make those steps. And those steps need to happen every day, every hour, every minute, every second. And it's draining, right? You're not always at your best and you don't always move forward. Sometimes you move to the side, sometimes you move to the back. But the most important thing to me is that we have a team that believes in what we're doing and we feel like we're getting a little bit better every day. And we don't know when that will lead to a breakthrough. We hope it's sooner, not later. But we have a lot of conviction in each other and our ability, as long as we keep making progress, that ultimately that trailing indicator of the output of that progress will be seen. We are way too early, but at the same time, my biggest anxiety around Nextdoor is how long is this going to take? How long is it going to take for us to turn around the product? How long is it going to take for us to put something out there that our neighbors love in a way that they don't love today? We have limited time, right? So balancing these two opposing views, which is you're not going to be able to flip a switch and change everything immediately. And there's extreme urgency because the world doesn't wait for anyone or anything. Balancing those two things, that's one of the big challenges.
Yeah, it seems like you're in an interesting spot where you're kind of acting like a startup. Like you're kind of like, all right, we need to do things. We need to move. We need to think about the product, what kind of changes. I know you want to make changes to the product, but then you're also a publicly traded company where it's quarter to quarter. I think by the time this comes out, Q3 earnings will come out a couple of weeks prior. And it's like, you kind of gotta, how do you think about that? Like being a public company, but also.
I love that you brought that up because it takes us to something we were talking about before we officially began, which is this book called The Founder's Mentality, which I love. In fact, I got a copy right here. So I'm hoping that you read this and that many of the listeners will pick it up as well.
We'll throw a link in the description to the show, so you can talk about it. If people want to check it out and buy it, they can order it online.
Well, and the idea behind the founder's mentality, and this is a book that was written in 2015. And as I mentioned to you, I'm shocked that as a 3-time founder in Silicon Valley, I've never seen the book. I found it when I was researching things to write my first letter to shareholders as a public company CEO. And I wanted to explore this idea that you just laid out, which is how do you blend the dueling attributes of a startup and a more mature company? Because both of those have advantages and both of them have deficiencies. The startup has the advantage of insurgency. The startup thinks that it can change the world, but the startup doesn't have many resources to do that, right? The incumbent has the disadvantage of moving slowly and of all of these processes and all the bureaucracy that invariably comes along the way as you're building a large company. But the incumbent has the advantage of scale, has the advantage of resources. And so is there a way to blend these two things? And I found this book, and it's an absolutely brilliant book because it's not a point of view that is in some way an idea. It's actually an empirically written book based on hundreds of interviews with founders of successful companies. And they are successful because they have scaled from being a startup to being an incumbent. They've not actually tapered off. They've not never been able to get on the ground. I mean, they don't need transformation, or if they need a transformation, they were able to transform themselves. And there's a concept in the book called develop and deliver. And it's a very important concept. It's this idea that startups are all about developing. Innovation is about developing. Big companies, particularly public ones on this quarterly cadence, they're all about delivering. You hear that old expression, beat and raise, right? So you deliver your results and you beat whatever the estimates are, and then you raise guidance and you just rinse and repeat over and over again. That's delivering over a long period of time, which builds credibility, which makes shareholders want to own your stock. But startups, they're not delivering anything except for innovation, and innovation needs to be developed. And so can you build a culture? And this is the real question for us at Nextdoor. Can we build a culture that is good at developing, because we have to be good at developing? That's innovation. We're a technology company. If our product development folks can't innovate, if we can't develop, we will almost certainly lose relevance. And that's kind of what we feel like has already happened. But on the other hand, we're a public company. We have lots of shareholders, right? We have to do our best to deliver as much value as we can to them on an ongoing basis. And that requires real results that are predictable and measurable and consistent, right? And so that dual challenge of developing and delivering, I love it because one of my board members, who's the first investor in Nextdoor and the venture capitalist that I've worked with the most, I've worked with him for over 20 years, Bill Gurley, he has this expression that comes from another great business book, Jim Collins' Built to Last. And the expression is the tyranny of the or. Most people get themselves caught in a dilemma where they say, we can either innovate or we can scale. We can either develop or we can deliver. Well, that's the tyranny of the word or. You have to find and. What is the right way for us to develop and deliver? It may not be 50-50. It may not be that we can do both those things in the same quarter, but we have to constantly be pushing ourselves to say, what are the things that need to be developed? And that's about innovation. That's a little bit more of a long-term perspective. And what are the things that we need to deliver? Because execution is absolutely the lifeblood of any successful company at any size. And so what I really like about the founder's mentality is you might think with that expression, the founder's mentality, it's about founding a company, it's about startups. It's not. It's not even just for founders. It's about taking a point of view that enables you to use some of those unfair advantages that founders and startups have and apply them at all stages of the company life cycle. And that to me was a huge eye-opener because I thought the same thing you did. we need to operate like a startup, but we're a public company. How are we possibly going to reconcile those two things? Well, you know what? We have to, and not just now, but forever. Forever, we want the advantage of the startup with the advantage of the incumbent. And that requires, I think, a very intentional set of things that you do culturally.
Are there any companies that you feel have done this right over the past, I don't know, couple decades?
All successful technology companies have had to do this, right? So I've been around for many decades in this industry. It's kind of amazing that Apple and Microsoft are the two most highly valued companies in the world, because in our industry at various points, both of those companies have been left for dead.
Yeah, Apple almost went bankrupt in the 90s.
Apple almost went bankrupt, and Microsoft, you remember with the rise of Google, Microsoft was seen as completely irrelevant. You had the rise of Google and you had the creation of the iPhone, and where's Microsoft's place in the ecosystem, right? And then the cloud comes along, and Satya is able to reinvent them again. Now, he's not even the founder, right? But those successful companies, and certainly Google is one of them. I mean, we see what Google's doing now with AI and Gemini. They are literally cannibalizing themselves. They are putting those results above the 10 blue links that make them money, because they know that if they don't disrupt themselves, someone else is going to. Zuck does this all the time, right? He sees something that's working externally. It's the metaverse. Okay, huge effort into the metaverse. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Then he sees AI, huge effort into AI. The best technology companies, they have these kinds of cultures. They are constantly delivering results, stunning results at their scale. These are trillion-dollar companies that are growing 30% year over year. It's just unheard of. But they are also innovating in a way that creates future glory. And so this is really the story of our industry. And so if you want to be a great company in our industry, you got to figure out a way to do this.
So I think it begs the question then, kind of tying it back to Nextdoor, thinking about all the opportunities that you kind of have in front of you. What are you most excited about right now?
Oh, I'm most excited about the same thing that was exciting to me that the first couple months that we were starting the company, which is local from a business standpoint is one of the only remaining massive consumer opportunities. It's not owned by Meta. It's not owned by Alphabet. It's not owned by Amazon. It's not owned by Apple. Local's hard. There are dozens of companies trying to do things in local, none of which have established a scale that would even get close to any of those companies that I just mentioned.
Who would maybe be biggest? Like if we had like the stack rank them?
I think maybe Zillow is one of the biggest at 13 or 15 billion, right? But the majority of them are all sub 10 billion market caps, right? And there are maybe a dozen of them, whether it's Yelp or Angie's List or Thumbtack or, Eventbrite or Nextdoor, this whole host of players. And they're all delivering some value because they're still in business and they've created decent sized businesses, but they haven't been able to really follow suit with the rest of the verticals in the internet, which is you have one or two people that really gain separation and they build massive businesses. So we knew that even in 2010 when we started the company. So that has always been this incredible North Star from a business standpoint, because one of the things you realize as a founder is you don't know when you come up with an idea how big it might be. You think it's going to be big. I mean, you think it's going to be big, right? But if you're the person who invented Google search, I don't think Larry and Sergey knew that it could serve as the operating system for the internet. I think they were solving a problem for themselves. I don't think Zuck knew that Facebook would ultimately have 1 billion people. He was creating something for Harvard, right? And so you have that first idea and you think, oh, this is something that I would find compelling. And I have a small audience that thinks it would be compelling as well. I mean, even Amazon, Bezos says today, oh, my vision was always to have every category, but what's the biggest business at Amazon right now? It's AWS.
Yeah, that was not the plan when he started a bookstore.
You have no idea that that's where it was going to go, right? And so the fact that we're sitting here 14 years later and that local has not been dominated by a single company, it's still a massive business opportunity. That is a North Star that really excites me. The other thing that really excites me from a human standpoint, the opportunity to build local community and make people or enable people to feel better about where they live, that's meaningful. Now, we're a business, so this is not a social justice cause, or this isn't something where the way we make people feel is the most important thing. I mean, we are a for-profit business, but we're very lucky. And what excites us is, in the service of building a great business, we should also be able to help people feel more connected on a local level. And so there's no conflict for us. So the quality of this idea, as someone who started multiple companies, some of which have not been good ideas that I found out, right? The quality of this idea, its potential, its potential size, impact, and scope, that's something that you just cannot take for granted. Because the actual business metrics are a lagging indicator, and because we've identified a transformation of the product as the thing that really needs to happen, we're not going to have instant gratification here. Do I feel like things are going well? I'm an optimist. I tend to see the world as glass half full. And so I think things are going well because we're executing better than I believe we have in the past. We have a product vision that we believe in that we're starting to test, and we're getting good feedback on that front. Things like attrition levels are lower than they've been. Our ability to recruit great people, those are certainly the way that we want them to be. But as I told someone recently, we're selling hope right now.
I mean, it's a startup.
We're selling this potential future. We're not selling something that you can put in the bank today, right? And so, yes, I'm optimistic. I'm excited. I believe deeply. I'm also terrified. I'm also paranoid. I'm also anxious. I also feel like I get kicked in the stomach 100 times a day. I mean, it's a little bit like that develop and deliver. I mean, you can be excited and nervous at the same time. You can be optimistic and deeply concerned that what you're optimistic about is not going to work, right? I mean, it's that Andy Grove, only the paranoid survive kind of thing. I mean, this is why being a founder takes such an emotional toll. Because, you hear this kind of throwaway line, the highs are higher and the lows are lower, right? And you live and die every day. It's actually true. You don't have a stable emotional sense of life and the world when you're building one of these things, right? You learn something one day that gets you really excited. The very next day, you learn something that makes you feel like you have no shot, right? You hire an amazing person. The next day, one of your best people decides to leave and work somewhere else. This is actually the life. This is what the job is. I think maybe the one advantage I bring to the table is I just recently turned 53, so I'm no spring chicken over here, and I've been through a couple of these wars before. And so it's not a new experience for me. It's just as visceral as it has always been. Just as visceral. I mean, I was telling you before we started, just before the call, I was on with a board member. I mean, the board members, they're so helpful. They are so engaged, but they're always pushing. And it's their job. They're always pushing you to do more, go faster, think further, be more ambitious. That's tiring. I'm doing the best I can, right? It's tiring, but I love the game. And one of the things that I tell the team all the time is, look, when we were kids or when we decided we wanted to be in business or when we were early in our careers, this is the kind of opportunity we dreamed about. To take a public company that has the potential to have 1 billion or more users and make it successful, that isn't something that everyone gets to do. So let's bring it with everything we have. Like, let's go. And that is probably the thing I feel the best about, which is folks around here have embraced that challenge. Like, they want it. We don't know exactly how to do it, when it's going to happen, or how we're going to be able to measure the impact. Those are all things we have to find out. We have to figure out. But the first thing you need that commitment. You need the conviction. You need the belief and the desire. And we've got that.
So I think one thing I really want to hit on is going back to before Nextdoor. You talked about the importance of family. You're originally from Texas. You decided to move to Silicon Valley, go to Stanford. What was the decision like to do that?
Well, it was like getting hit by a pitch or winning a lottery ticket. When I was growing up in Odessa, Texas, which is a small city in West Texas, I didn't really have a lot of exposure to a broad range of different choices. My parents are both physicians. I'm of Indian descent, so I think in some ways I can only be an engineer or a doctor, right? That's the stereotype from back then. And I was fine with that. I really aspired to be a physician. Like, I really wanted to be a surgeon like my dad. He's someone that I've always looked up to and I've admired very deeply. And I would have loved to just follow in his footsteps. And so for me, going to Stanford, it was really about trying to go to the best possible college that I could have the opportunity to attend. It wasn't because it was Silicon Valley, because it was technology. I went there as a pre-med, having zero intention of being in business or of being in technology. And it was just very serendipitous. But in retrospect, especially, it makes sense. So living in Odessa, Texas, one is, I don't want to say victim, but one is certainly in a circumstance where geography confines you to your worldview. You live in West Texas, it's 300 miles from Dallas, it's 300 miles from El Paso. It's not like you're in the suburb of a big city. You're not in a great college town like Ann Arbor where you are, right?
Yeah, didn't you go to the high school that Friday Night Lights, the TV shows? And I think I heard or saw that somewhere.
100% Odessa Permian High School I attended. And the book Friday Night Lights was written about the class of 89, and I was the class of 90. So not only did I go to that high school, I went to the high school and lived many of the things in the book. And look, some of it was not great, which is an over-reliance on football and its importance and that sort of thing. But some of it was great, which is a sense of community that ultimately led in many ways to the creation of Nextdoor. And a pride in coming together as a group of people in this town and being part of something much bigger than any of the individuals, which is something I've taken with me. But no, Stanford was, the late 80s when I was in high school, and Stanford was starting to really emerge, and Gorbachev had just visited Stanford. And when I was growing up, the Cold War was the thing that was dominating all the headlines, right? So this more of a union, less frosty relationship between the USSR and the USA, that was a big deal. And so probably partially as a result of that, we used to look at US News and World Report and look at the college rankings. And I looked at that, and Stanford was ranked number 1 that year. And I thought to myself, oh gosh, wouldn't it be amazing if I could go to Stanford? And I was very lucky and I went there. But I think maybe a more interesting part of the story is I get to Stanford. I realize very quickly, almost everyone I meet is smarter than me.
It's a good feeling, but also kind of like a oh shit feeling as well too.
Oh, it was definitely terrifying. I mean, it was definitely a gut check, of the highest magnitude. And because I'd just gone to a public school in the middle of nowhere, I had not even taken an AP class. And so I'm there and in the mix with folks who have had college prep educations who are telling me Stanford's easy for them compared to their high schools. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't even know how to study. And so as a pre-med, you need to know how to study. And I struggled. And it was not something that came easily to me the way that I wanted things to come easily to me. And meanwhile, I had an Ethernet connection in my dorm room. And so even though I was not thinking about technology or was a technologist, I loved computers. My favorite subject in high school was computer science. Strangely, I didn't know how I would use that to build a career because I wanted to be a doctor, but I was interested in writing code and the way that I could write code to solve problems. That was something, being a builder, even if I couldn't articulate it at the time, it was something that was more meaningful to me than even something like studying chemistry or biology or physics. And so I get to Stanford and I have an Ethernet connection and I can go online. And this is pre-browser, by the way.
So how did you access the internet this is early 90s?
Yeah, I went to Usenet. So Usenet was a collection of communities, which is probably one of the reasons why I've been working on community my entire career. And it's kind of funny, growing up in Texas, huge Dallas Cowboys football fan.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
I was in the Bay Area in the early 90s when the biggest rivalry was the Cowboys and the 49ers, the San Francisco 49ers. And so I couldn't really go outside my dorm room and tell people I was a Cowboys fan because they didn't want to hear it. They were 49ers fans. So I went online and I found a community of Dallas Cowboys fans and I connected to them. And it was an immediate epiphany for me that if I had had that when I was growing up in Odessa, it wouldn't matter that I was growing up in Odessa. I could go online And I could experience any place in the world because of this incredible virtual technology. And so it's kind of profound on a lot of levels. It's why I ultimately was drawn to technology, that empowerment of not feeling like because I live in Odessa, I'm limited to only the things I see in Odessa. It was an immediate benefit to me, this internet thing that has now empowered the entire world to do whatever they want to do no matter where they live. But it's also kind of ironic and profound because Nextdoor is really about the opposite. It's not about dwelling in the virtual world. It's about using the virtual tools to make the physical world stronger. And so Reid Hoffman is someone that I consider a great mentor, and I'm lucky to call him a friend. And he has this expression that entrepreneurs tend to work on the same problem their entire careers. It may be through multiple companies, but it's that one problem that keeps coming back. For me, I would say primarily because I grew up in Odessa, that problem is around building community, which is what I loved about Odessa, but transcending geography, which is something I didn't like about being in Odessa. And so it just so happens that user generated content, online community, and the internet more broadly is the perfect solution to those things that I just discussed. And so that's what led me there. I was just so lucky to be at Stanford because that gave me the opportunity to be around the folks who were starting these companies, including the folks who started Yahoo. And as a completely unqualified wannabe pre-med who wasn't getting it done, I was able to join Yahoo as a surfer. That was my title, Surfing Yahoo. Imagine explaining that to your Indian physician parents who had paid for you to go to Stanford. That wasn't the easiest conversation, but back then, Yahoo had engineers, a few executives, and then Yahoo was trying to classify all of the internet's websites into a directory. So they needed web surfers who would take those submitted sites and put them into categories. And that was the role that I was able to play. It's kind of an early version of a product manager, but with an ontology or almost a kind of classification kind of focus, because you're taking these sites in, you have to quickly assess them, and then you have to put them into the categories where they should exist. Now, soon thereafter, Yahoo became a full-fledged media company. And so it had Yahoo Finance and Yahoo Sports and all of these other properties. And I was lucky to work with marketing teams that were building those brands and, ultimately learn much more than just the classification of websites. But it was all luck. It was not qualification. I mean, my story is one of just being so lucky, being at the right place at the right time, being inspired by people around me, and then just trying to make the most of those things.
And then you started your first company too, back in the late 90s. What was it and how'd that go?
I was at Yahoo from 96 to 99, and that was just a golden era to be at a place like Yahoo. I mean, I was one of the first 100 employees, and I think by the time I left, there were 10,000 employees.
Holy cow.
The market
Wow.
the market cap went from 500 million to 100 billion. And yet I knew that if one day I didn't show up to work, or if I were crossing the street and I wasn't looking both ways and I got run over, no one at Yahoo would have even noticed. I mean, I was not driving their success in any way, shape, or fashion. I was just so lucky to be there. And as the tide was rising, I was rising with it. And so I wanted to understand, can I build a Yahoo? Can I be part of influencing the world in a positive way, the way Yahoo is? And so while at Yahoo, I'd started with a couple of friends, this nonprofit for entrepreneurs, where we got together once a month to talk about new business ideas. And again, right time, right place. No intention of that leading to anything, but that was the monthly gathering where Larry and Sergey would come, where Reid Hoffman came, Elon came. All of these folks that you hear about today, they all came to this thing called Round Zero.
It was a dinner series, sort of?
It was a monthly dinner where we picked a topic and we had an hour of networking, and then we sat down at small tables of 5 or 6, and there could be 100 people at the dinner, and we'd have 20 different tables, and we would talk about something that was happening in technology. Is Microsoft going to continue its dominance? What does it mean when the venture capitalists are the ones that are actually funding all of the revenue that's being generated by these ad-driven companies? All of these things that we talk about today. And I met this absolutely brilliant person, Naval at one of the round zero dinners. And he had this, what I felt at the time was a brilliant idea around user generated content and online reviews called Epinions. And I was lucky enough to start a company with him. And that was my first one in 1999. It was called Epinions, which I admit is a very .com era name, anything. I probably wouldn't go there again, but electronic opinions. And that was really that was my moment where I got to become an entrepreneur. And I was a founder, which to me is the most important title. It's a more important title than CEO or board member or chairman or any of those other things, because it means you were there at the very beginning and building, creating, starting from scratch. Those are things that really matter to me. And so we started the company in 1999, and we went through a lot of highs and we went through a fair number of lows, some real true near-death experiences. And that was my arena. That was really where I started to learn, what is it like to build one of these things and how hard is it really? Because Yahoo didn't feel hard because I wasn't doing any of the lifting. But once I got to Opinions, I was one of few people who were doing most of the lifting, and it was not easy. It was not easy, but gosh, what an incredible experience. And meanwhile, that was kind of the micro, trying to build Opinions, but the macro was, you have the dot-com boom, you have the dot-com bust, you have the slight return. I mean, you're living through these cycles and understanding that, again, you as a company cannot be tone deaf to what's happening outside the four walls. You can't control what's going on outside the four walls. You can control what's going on inside, but you can't be tone deaf. And so needing to harmonize in an environment where capital is plentiful versus an environment where capital is not available, those require different strategies, right? In one, you're hiring like crazy and you're trying to take advantage of the fact that you can take on a lot of money for limited dilution and you can hopefully take some real steps forward in the business. But when capital's not plentiful, you have to do more with less. You have to deal with the resources you have, right? And so at one point, I think we had hundreds of people at Opinions. Then we went down to dozens of people. I mean, it's not fun to do the accordion. Once again, as I talked about, of going up and down, it's actually one of the more jarring things, but it is sometimes necessary because, you're a little bit of a rubber band. You're shooting out there and then you're coming back and you're shooting out again. And I learned so much at Opinions. Naval was the original CEO. I took over as CEO about a year in and didn't know what I was doing and had no background or qualifications really to be a CEO. I was the one that they chose, and I was really lucky, very, very lucky, because soon after I became CEO, Benchmark Capital, where Bill was at the time, brought me this CEO coach, Bill Campbell, maybe the most famous CEO coach in Silicon Valley history. He had been a CEO before, and when he was coaching me, he was also coaching Eric Schmidt, Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs. I used to joke with him and say, "Hey, what's it like to come to the farm league team after being, in the major leagues?" But Bill became more than a coach to me. He became like a second father. And I used to tell him, and I still believe this, anything good I've accomplished in my career as a CEO, he would get full credit for. Anything that I have done wrong, I have to take responsibility for because none of that came from him. But, just imagine again, as I look back on these memories in my life, how lucky can a person be? I mean, the fact that I went to Stanford, I never would have been in technology. The fact that Dave and Jerry were at Stanford starting Yahoo, I never would have gotten that job. Meeting Naval at round zero, I never would have started Epinions. Being at Epinions and having Bill Campbell, I never would have had any success without Bill Campbell. I met Bill Gurley in 1997 and have worked with him ever since, right? So my story is one of lots of different people at various points in my lives and lots of serendipitous blessings.
Yeah, I know you mentioned that I think Bill is on the board of Nextdoor, correct?
Yeah, Bill is a founding board member. In many ways, he's one of the founders of the company because he was there at the beginning. Nextdoor too, so many of these experiences have come out of adversity and, I don't like to say it, but failure. I mean, Bill had funded a previous company of mine called Fanbase, which was a community-centric effort to build a next generation ESPN. And it hadn't gone anywhere.
Yeah, going back to the The college dorm room, the Dallas Cowboys, yeah.
Well, back to the college dorm room and back to community and the whole thing. And it didn't work. We got to 15 million users in the first year. So we got a lot of false positives, but
Wait, you got to 15 million users. What does that mean in 2011, 2010-ish?
it was 2007. And it meant that we were very good at search engine optimization, which is where all those users came from. But they didn't stick, which is a problem, right? I mean, you can get them to come in at the top of the funnel, but if they're all ejected out of the bottom of the funnel, you're not going to build a successful business. And so I went to Bill and I said, look, this is not working. You and I have had one success together. Epinions ultimately became a company called shopping.com, which went public in 2004. And then in 2005, eBay bought it for a little over 600 million. So not a massive success by our industry's scale, but definitely a success, right? And so Bill and I had experienced that together, and I wanted to go on and do greater things. I'm sure he wanted to as well. And he's gone on to do much bigger things with Uber and other companies that he's funded. But I went to Bill and said, this isn't going to be the one. Fan base is not going to work. You know that. I know that. Why are we wasting our time on this? And we've only spent a few $1,000,000 of the 11 million that we've raised. Take the money back. And Bill said, nope, I believe in the team. I think you should take one summer and come up with a new idea and pursue it. And I remember telling him, Bill, you know the serendipity that has to occur to come up with a great idea. It's not as if you just put something in your Google Calendar that says 10 a.m., come up with $1 billion idea, right? That's just not the way these things work. And Bill said, yeah, I know, but I trust the team. And so give it a shot. And so we went back, that was the summer of 2010. And somehow we were lucky enough to come up with the idea for Nextdoor. I mean, I'll mention one other thing. I mean, Bill did kind of challenge me. He looked at me and said, hey, kind of seems like you're giving up. You know, what's going on here, right? And he slid across a piece of paper, and it was the poem If from Rudyard Kipling, which many people may recognize because several verses from the poem are in the locker rooms at Wimbledon. And so it's about trying to rise up in the arena and be a champion. And so much of it, and this is what the poem's about, so much of it is the inner battle. It's not the outer battle against other people, other companies, other rivals, other opponents. It's about being the best version of yourself. And so that kind of tweaked me when he gave me that poem, because I loved the poem anyway, and I felt challenged, and I thought, okay, we're going to give it one more run, and was very, very lucky that my co-founders came up with the idea for Nextdoor, and then we worked on it. But again, the point I'll make, and it's for all the founders that are listening out there, be open to serendipity. I don't know about everyone's journey. I'm sure there are folks out there that have earned every single penny of whatever they've gained, but my experience has been that there's a whole lot of serendipity and luck, and if you put yourself in the right situations, and typically that's about being where the action is. That's about being around people that inspire you. That's about growing and stretching and challenging yourself. If you have the courage to be in the arena, good things can happen.
Yeah. So when you mentioned kind of the serendipity, the calendar event, the timeline, do you remember how the idea came up initially?
Oh, I remember it very, very viscerally. I remember it because it was not the only idea we came up with. So we went back to the drawing board and we read several books. Steve Blank's book about lean startup. We read a book called The Product Market Fit Epiphany. We were trying to get smart because we were coming off of failure. And at the time, the conventional wisdom is you come up with as many ideas as possible, and then you run them to ground one by one. And then that creates a small set that you may do some prototyping around, and then you test the prototypes. And ultimately, where you see the signal is where you go. That was not that period of time was, we'd already moved past this Silicon Valley mythology, which is you wake up in the morning and you have this idea, and the idea ends up being Apple computer, right? It was much more, I think, in reality, you either start with a small problem that you want to solve for yourself, which is kind of Larry and Sergey said, look, we're not getting the results we want from any of the existing search engines. Let's create a better one. Or it's just serendipity and luck. You just stumble upon an idea and you start to realize, oh my gosh, this is one with big potential and opportunity, and then you follow it. So we had come up with many ideas. We were doing lots of brainstorming. We were doing testing. We would we would build a website that would say coming soon, and then we would describe the idea, and then we would buy AdWords against that idea to see what is the potential demand. And we would first see what's the click-through rate on the ad, and the ad would be the value proposition of the idea. And then once they get to that page, we would have a little box that would say, enter your email if you want to be notified when we build this thing. And that would be another indicator, how badly do people want this thing? In the meantime, one of our team members shared with the group an op-ed that had been written in the New York Times by David Brooks about the decline of community in America. And one of my other co-founders, Sarah Leary, who I've been lucky enough, again, as I think about the people who've changed the arc of my life, and in this case, she's changed it both professionally and personally. She's like a sister. I've worked with her since the early days of Epinions. I was lucky enough to hire her in 1999. And so we've worked together for 25 years.
And she came back too recently also to Nextdoor. I think I saw that. Yeah.
Really lucky to have her back. And our head of comms is a wonderful woman, Kelsey Grady, who was working on comms for us in the first 7 or 8 years of Nextdoor. And so there have been a couple of boomerangs, as we call them. But Sarah had taken sociology at Harvard as an undergrad under a professor named Robert Putnam. And Robert Putnam had written this book, this seminal book called Bowling Alone. And that book was about the decline of community in America. And it wasn't about Nextdoor. It was about this idea that social cohesion at a local level has been one of the most important factors in the American dream, in making people feel connected, making people feel like their communities matter, and making people feel supported. And one example of that is the sport of bowling, which in his book, it was a construct because the popularity of the sport bowling has stayed the same. But people no longer bowl in bowling leagues, which was a social activity. They now bowl alone. So why have they gone from bowling in leagues to bowling alone? And the bowling leagues were such a big part of those communities back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And there are a number of factors which are kind of obvious to us now. Technology is a big one. Technology has played a big role in keeping us inside versus going outside, and keeping us within ourselves as singular beings versus within a community of people, right? And whether that's television or now the internet, it's undeniable what this has done. And so those things kind of came together, and we thought to ourselves, okay, social networks are starting to really emerge. At that point, Facebook was clearly taking off. Twitter was taking off. LinkedIn was taking off. There wasn't a social network that was devoted to what we believed was the most important community of them all, and that is the community in which you live. There was a social network for friends. There was a social network for colleagues. There was a social network for people that you find interesting. That was Twitter. There was no social network for your neighbors. And so I wish I could say that it was this incredible epiphany moment where we said, we know how to build $1 billion company. It's the social network for neighborhoods. It was much more, oh, this could be interesting. But wow, local's incredibly hard to scale. And how are we going to do this? And so from that summer of 2010 until we launched Nextdoor publicly was over a year of slowly testing, of finding product market fit, of listening to user feedback. And ultimately, when we launched Nextdoor in October of 2011, we had about 200 neighborhoods using it across 26 states of the country. And I remember going to one of our first board meetings and saying, hey, we've been able to get 175 neighborhoods to use Nextdoor. That's amazing. And Bill, or maybe it was Rich Barton, one of our other founding board members, said, hey, how many neighborhoods are there in America? And one of the management team members said, oh, we think there are about 300,000. And I said, stop, before you even do the calculation, I know that we're on a 100-year run rate, but we'll figure out a way to scale this thing faster than we did in the first year. And lo and behold, here we are today, over 300,000 neighborhoods using Nextdoor 14 years later. But I remember viscerally all of those things. I wish I could say that we were ultimately super confident and we knew what would happen. We didn't. However, we had a very strong feeling. And then we worked really hard to vet that feeling, to inform that feeling, to confirm the feeling, and then to expand it. And that's what we're still doing. That to me is the magic behind building one of these things. Yes, you do have an intuition. You do have an insight. You do have a feeling. And that's qualitative. But then you take all the quantitative stuff, the hard work, the measurement, the A/B testing, the user feedback, And you apply all of that to the intuition. And that's what ultimately creates something that can succeed. And if you're really lucky, you have people around the table who have different strengths in that process. So I would consider myself to be more intuitive. I would consider Sarah Leary, my co-founder, to be much more empirical. So when the two of us get together, I'm dreaming and she's thinking about how do we test the dream to ensure that it's real. And that ends up being a very powerful combination.
So then when you talk, okay, you have 175 neighborhoods, you're sitting in the boardroom. Obviously today, 300,000. There's a time period in between that. How did you really start to scale it up? Because I've heard you mention before that growth was actually really hard.
Yeah, we did a lot of things that felt to people counterintuitive relative to the way growth hacking was being done.
Oh yeah, fair. Yeah, you're right in like the heyday of it.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, I mentioned that failed company Fanbase that had gotten to 15 million users on SEO. The first company, shopping.com, what was formerly known as Epinions, the reason we had to sell the company is we had such a large SEO dependency that when Google changed its index and we fell out of the index as a public company, because that company had gone public, we couldn't get back in the index fast enough. We lost a lot of our free cash flow, and the company was really punished from a stock price perspective. And if you can't control your own destiny, it's kind of hard to be a public company. And so one of the early decisions we made was the content's going to be private because neighbors don't want the things they're discussing to be accessible by people outside the neighborhood. But that decision means we're not going to have any SEO. So we're going to have no discovery, no traffic, no distribution that's driven by people going to Google and typing in great plumber Ann Arbor, which would be a perfect search for Nextdoor because in all the Ann Arbor neighborhoods, they talk about the best plumbers all the time as it relates to Nextdoor. And so that was a decision we made early on. The other decision was by virtue of taking on a challenge through a social network, which typically social networks are fueled by virality, but understanding that in our system, the whole purpose for Nextdoor was that we don't know our neighbors. There was this interesting kind of, it's a counterfactual because the factual is, okay, you're starting a social network, you're going to be fueled by virality. You invite someone and they invite all their neighbors, and then the whole neighborhood lights up. But in our sense, the whole reason you need to come to Nextdoor is you don't know your neighbors. So in that sense, you can't have the same level of virality. So we were constrained there. And then the third and final thing we did is growth hackers always talk about reducing friction. Don't require name, don't require anything that would get in the way, a password, don't require anything that would get in the way of the person just joining the service. We said, actually, trust is really important to us. We need a first name, a last name, we need a physical address, and then we're not going to activate your account until we verify that you live where you say you live. And so we used to send through snail mail, postcards with a verification code to ensure that the people on Nextdoor were actually who they said they were. So those three things are just three examples. Not having SEO, picking a problem where virality would be an obvious solution, but having anti-virality. And then the third thing is creating as much friction as possible to ensure great fidelity at the end. Those were three examples of things that over the years, we've hired so many people from Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or places where they really understand virality. And they've come in and said, well, this would be easy to grow because you just got to do this thing that we've done at the other company. And then they realize, actually, that's not in the DNA of Nextdoor. And so how did we grow? We grew through providing a great experience so that neighbors would tell their neighbors in the real world, you should join Nextdoor. And it has taken us a long time to grow. I mean, we are now finally approaching 100 million verified neighbors. And to do that over 14 years is much longer than someone like Facebook or Instagram or X or any of the other social networks. But we feel like we've always focused on quality, not quantity, and the quantity has come. Our issue today is not that we aren't growing. The issue today is we want deeper engagement. We want to become indispensable. We want folks to feel like if they don't check Nextdoor every single day, they'll miss out on something critical that's happening in their local community. And there are moments where they feel that way today. If there's a hurricane that's coming through, if there's a tornado, if there's a wildfire, folks are on Nextdoor every single minute because that's where they're getting the information. But we don't want to wait for natural disasters and crises until people will rely on Nextdoor. We want to tell you the best thing to do this weekend in your local community. We want to tell you the stories of the high school athletes that you want to rally behind who live around you. We want to tell you about the best place to buy tacos and the new restaurant that's come in the neighborhood. We want to educate you on the mayoral race or the ballots that are up for discussion. And so this is where Nextdoor needs to go, because even in the time that Nextdoor was created and has evolved, access to local news, whether it's through a newspaper or through a newscast or through any other publisher or publication, those things have all declined. Where do we go to get local information? The answer should be Nextdoor.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're recording this on US election day, and you could argue that local elections are actually more important than federal. Like the more local you get.
They're at least equally important. And I remember when I learned when I was living in San Francisco and someone said, oh, less than 60% of the country votes in the presidential election. And I was floored. And then they proceeded to say less than 20% of the people in San Francisco vote in the local election. And I was devastated because, the interesting thing is a lot more than 20% of the people complain about what's going on in San Francisco. And a lot more than 20% of the people, I hope 100%, care deeply about San Francisco being great. What can they do about it? Well, you got to vote. You got to start there, right? And yet we don't even know the issues. I mean, if you think misinformation's bad at a national level and you think it's hard to keep up with everything that's going on with the national election, imagine local. Where do I go? In the old days, it was the newspaper or it was the town hall or it was me sitting on my porch having a discussion with the person next door. Who are you going to vote for? Are you going to vote yes on that initiative? What do you think of this thing that they're trying to do? Right? And those things have all dried up. And so we don't want to punch above our weight. It's not like Nextdoor is this magical panacea or some antidote to the fact that we've lost touch with our communities. But we can certainly be part of the solution. And I think a very big part of the solution. And that's a high bar. And that's the bar we have to set for ourselves.
You were a shark on Shark Tank for a little bit during kind of the step away from Nextdoor. I got to ask, what was that like?
It was incredible. I mean, it was, again, just such an incredible opportunity and a blessing. And Shark Tank to me is about the American dream. It's about entrepreneurship. It's about having an idea, going into the arena, trying to convince titans of the industry that your idea has legs, and then everything that comes along with that. So when I was given the opportunity, my gosh, I mean, it's like a dream for me. In fact, interestingly, I got to be one of the sharks, but my whole professional career, I've been on the other side. I've been the entrepreneur who's talking to the sharks. Some things that people might be surprised to know about Shark Tank. The first thing is, it's not scripted.
Do you get the pitches ahead of time? Do you know?
We do not get the pitches. We are seeing the pitches and learning about the companies in real time. And that's a little demanding, right? Because you might see a pitch edited down to, 15 minutes or so in a show. It's more like 50 minutes when we're seeing it. So there's more time, but there's not that much time. And I can only imagine how nerve-wracking it is to come in to that music and you walk into that room and there's Mark Cuban and there's Barbara Corcoran and there's, all the sharks that you've seen. There's Mr. Wonderful. And yet it's a really, really nurturing environment. It's called Shark Tank, right? But the sharks are there because they love entrepreneurship and they want to lift these people up. And even the folks who come in and you're thinking to yourself, this thing is never going to work. That is one of the most terrible ideas I've ever heard.
You can't say that.
Well, some people do say that, right? But they say it in a nice way because look, on some level, if there's a great entrepreneur out there and the entrepreneur is pursuing something and you have an insight as to why it's not going to work, you don't want to not share that. In fact, you want to share it. You may be wrong. The entrepreneur may disagree, right? I mean, people have told me thousands of reasons why Nextdoor shouldn't exist and why it should fail. And some of the reasons have actually been good reasons. And so we've gone in different directions, and some of the reasons we've overcome. But that give and take hardens your idea, and it puts you in a position where you have to, again, really strengthen your assumptions and ensure that the reasons you're doing something and the ideas you have for how it would succeed, you have to make sure that that's really crisp and clean and will be successful. And that part of Shark Tank is something that I think any person who goes on Shark Tank, whether they get a deal or not, and by the way, the deals are real. I invested in multiple companies. That was my own money. That wasn't given to me by Shark Tank. As I used to joke with my wife, Shark Tank was a loss leader for us in our family until one of these investments works out, right? I mean, we paid to be on Shark Tank, literally, right? But the whole thing is real. And everyone who goes on Shark Tank, whether they get a deal or not, I know they benefit from the experience of having to, in some ways, justify your business in front of these people who are very good at quickly assessing whether a business has legs or not. A couple of other things I'll say. The Sharks are extremely collegial. They're very close with each other. They're friends. Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary, he's got a persona on the show, but he's a sweetheart.
Really?
He's a
Would
great
not have
guy.
expected that.
The other thing I'll say is, I mean, the Sharks they're really smart. And so I loved the banter both during the pitches, but also in between the pitches, because I was learning. I was learning a lot. And again, these folks see hundreds. I mean, you're an early stage investor. So this resonates with you, right? I mean, the more pitches you see, the more you start to develop a hypothesis for, well, here are the things I need when I invest in a company, and here are the things that really matter. You actually lay them out on your website. I went there and I saw, you said, here are some of the things that really matter to me. I remember the last one, would I want to work with this founder 10 years from now? I love that one, right? But all of those sharks have their own collection of those things. And to see them apply those criteria to the deals, it's fascinating. I mean, that was a huge privilege to be on that show. And it's kind of funny because to this day, the number of people who recognize me from being on Shark Tank, that show has a very large footprint. I mean, many people care about that show, and I was not as familiar with it, but it ends up being a really great way for kids to learn about business. And so I would encourage anyone with kids who have any kind of curiosity or interest about business, because you watch the show, it's well produced, it's entertaining, but you're learning about revenue, and you're learning about cost, and you're learning about unit economics, you're learning about competitive advantage, and you're learning about marketing, and you're learning it in a fun way. So from my standpoint, we need more Shark Tank. We need more things like Shark Tank. And I've always taken it for granted because I'm in Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley, you see that stuff all the time. But for the rest of the world, Shark Tank is an amazing resource.
Yeah, it's helpful when people ask, so Turner, what do you do? And, they're a mom in Ann Arbor. I'm like, it's venture capital. And, it's like Shark Tank. And like, oh yeah, I know that. So I think it's good for the world. People trying to build things, solve problems for people. I think we need more people like that.
I definitely feel now as a public company CEO that I have my own swimming in the shark pool, not quite at the level as the early stage Shark Tank kind of thing. But look, in life, we are always trying to move things forward and take ideas that we have and make them bigger and better. And the moments when you go into the tank, whether it's the metaphorical tank or the actual Shark Tank show, those are the moments when you feel most alive.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to end it. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for coming on the show. And thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the show notes if you want to go deeper on some of the topics mentioned throughout the conversation. If you like this episode, it would mean the world if you liked, subscribed, commented, followed, and shared it with a friend who can learn from it. And if you don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe to my newsletter, The Split, in the show notes, and you'll get links plus a transcript for every new episode emailed directly to your inbox. Thanks again for listening. See you in the next episode.
Hey everyone, Eric here. Ever wondered how the biggest names in tech turn pricing into their secret weapon for explosive growth? Well, I've got a new show for you that pulls back the curtain on the real levers of SaaS pricing. It's called Unpack Pricing, hosted by Scott Woody, who is the co-founder and CEO of Metronome, a usage-based billing platform powering billing for OpenAI, Anthropic, and Databricks. In each episode, Scott sits down with founders, executives, and pricing experts to break down how they use pricing to grow their business and drive revenue growth. You'll hear from founders like Spencer Kimball of Cockroach Labs on the realities of monetizing open source software, and from product and pricing leaders like Jesse Miller on navigating both product-led and sales-led growth. Whether you're a startup founder, product leader, or trying to acquire an edge in your understanding of tech business models, Unpack Pricing delivers insights you won't find anywhere else. Subscribe to Unpack Pricing, available wherever you get your podcasts. Head to the link in the show notes now.